So we're going to talk about the industrial economy. So what we've been looking at over the last day and a half or so has been social developments. So what's going on in terms of population growth, what's going on in terms of distribution, what's going on in terms of immigration, how does it affect people, what are the living conditions like, how do people respond to those challenges via political machines or through settlement houses. So we've done that already. But now what we want to look at is the actual growth of the economy itself. And I'm not sure I could overstate how remarkable the growth of the American economy during the Gilded Age is, right? We sort of began to toy around with industry in the 1830s, right? The Lowell system and so on, but that was incredibly small as compared to like the portion of our economy focused on agriculture at the time. And we developed a bit more industry moving towards the Civil War. The North had some manufacturing systems in place, which was one advantage they had during the Civil War. But in terms of being like the backbone of the economy, the thing driving American growth, industry was definitely not on the radar, even all the way up until the beginning of the Civil War. But partly because of the Civil War itself, partly because of like the rise in capital coming from the gold rush and so on, and partly just because of the technologies that developed after the American Civil War. So let's say 1865-ish or so onwards, American industry begins to boom in a way that shocks the whole world. To give some context, prior to the Gilded Age, the United States had almost no steel production to speak of, right? The Bessemer process hadn't been developed, we weren't heavy on industry, and so on. But after the year 1900, the U.S. outproduces Britain, Germany, and Russia combined in their production of steel. So we're talking about less than 50 years that the U.S. overtakes the next three largest industrialized countries. And we do so in a way and without any of the major kinds of upsets that we would have expected elsewhere. So why is that? Well, I guess I'm going to, sort of take a break from that. So we'll come back to the question of why, to look at just a series of kind of cool pictures. The point of these pictures is basically to say that industry is not just important in the Northeast. We often identify industry in the Northeast, but industry is going to be important nationwide with the notable exception of the South. So in the West, industry is used for agricultural processing, and it's every historian's favorite joke that in Chicago we had the first disassembly line, and it was a meat processing plant. So you can see some super unsavory pictures here. So they bring the cattle in from the west, right, on those cattle cars. And then once they're slaughtered, you can see like in the ceiling they have this sort of pulley system. So they would like hook each animal or each carcass to like a pulley, and then they would be pulling each of them sort of down this path. But can you see the floor at all? Because it looks disgusting to me. People are going to eat that food someday. Don't worry, we'll talk about how gross it is in the next period. Yeah, so then they'll begin partitioning the meat. Lots of workers there. Look at their coats, for example, in this bottom corner. Super sanitary, I can tell. Eventually it gets a little cleaner, right? But the floor, if you can't tell, is dirt still. It's cleaner dirt, not so much spotting, but still dirt. And then eventually they'll haul off portions of the carcass for processing because some very wealthy Americans could afford fresh meat, like to have steak, for example, but most Americans couldn't afford that. They couldn't afford the cost of the refrigerated car or home refrigeration, and so most Americans are going to be eating processed meats, and like Spam, right? That kind of processed meat. Yeah. So the idea being that it had to be edible without refrigeration. So we'll get more into that later, but just know that industrial processes, things like breaking down a task into a whole bunch of small steps, which we then mechanize and give individually to workers to like improve efficiency. This is important in the West as well. But okay, so back to why does America develop so quickly? And the answer are up here on the screen. There are 6 of them. So first, we have lots of cheap and available natural resources. Unlike, say, the British, who live on a tiny island with fairly few natural resources of their own, thus the giant British Empire, we have pretty much everything we could possibly need right here in the good old US of A. That's the one advantage to having a country the size of a continent. Then we have plenty of available labor. First of all, we have a pretty large population anyway because this is the United States and there's plenty of room and people are procreating and all that business. But then you add in immigration. the rates of which, as we saw yesterday, are increasing rapidly, and we have essentially an endless supply of labor. And not only is it good because we need workers, it's also good because the more labor you have, the lower the cost, the lower the wage, and therefore the lower the cost of production. So that's a pretty big benefit. Then we have the capital that is available. Lots of it comes from the gold rush itself. American capitalism, more broadly speaking, we had begun to develop organizations for business, so things like corporations that allow people to start to sell stock to raise capital. So we have the available funds for investment because any industrial venture is always going to begin with a pretty sizable investment. Then we have government support. And when I say government support, I mean that no matter which party is in power, what they're doing is going to be pretty good for business. So when the Republicans are in power, they were the sort of descendants of the Whigs, right? They tend to believe in more government regulation or restrictions. The Democrats, of course, descendants of Andrew Jackson, tended to, at this time, be very much for laissez-faire policies. But here's the deal. Both of those things are okay by business. Businesses would sure like to have tariffs and protectionism and grants or loans from the U.S. government. Those are all Republican-style policies at this time. But even if the government doesn't do anything actively in favor of business, the fact that the U.S. government was not interested in regulating business or imposing significant taxes or imposing significant restrictions on the ways or kinds of things that they could produce means that businesses had it pretty good, right? So no matter who was in charge of the United States, we tended to have really strong business-friendly policies. Then there's all the technology. There's something to be said for coming of age industrially in a time when technology is increasing so rapidly. I guess we could compare it maybe to like, did I do research projects when I was in college? Absolutely I did. And I had to find all kinds of sources, and I had to, look up all kinds of information and gather and amalgamate all that. But did I do it nearly as efficiently as you can do research now? No, because the kinds of technologies and search engines that are available to you didn't exist when I was doing those kinds of things. And that's just a fairly smallish span of time between those two instances. But if we compare like a century between when Britain began to really industrialize in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, and when the United States gets serious about industrialization, in that century we've seen the growth of interchangeable parts, we've seen the rise of the Bessemer process and cheaper steel, we've seen all sorts of innovations related to like steam-powered engines. And all of those things mean that when we get in the game, we're able to pick everything up much more quickly than the British ever could, which helps to explain some of the speed of American industrialization. Then there's transportation, and that's sort of like a little add-on there at the end, because of course we could have all of those things, but did I remind you that we have a ginormous country? If they were all spread out all over the place and we didn't have a strong transportation infrastructure, then either it would be really costly to get resources to production facilities, or really costly to get produced goods out to the markets. But thanks to our good friend Henry Clay, you thought we'd lost him. No, we haven't. Thanks to our good friend Henry Clay, we have lots of infrastructure in the United States. It has been encouraged by the governments of the various states and of the United States national government for decades. And so we have plenty of those transportation connections like railroads, roads, canals, and so on. So anyway, what I want you to do is to try to take a minute here and see if you can, if you wrote all those things in your notes, set your notes aside. If you didn't write them in your notes, then try right now and write on a whiteboard. If you didn't write in your notes, then try right now. How many of those 6 can you remember? Go. Why did the U.S. industrialize so quickly? What factors helped us to grow so rapidly? All right, if you were able to name at least 4 of them without looking, would you give yourself a nice pat on the back and tell yourself how awesome you are? Look at me and my good short-term memory. I appreciate that. Very good. Now what I want you to do is to see if you can add a specific detail supporting at least 3 of them. I'll steal one from you. Too bad, so sad. And for transportation, a specific example might be the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. So you want to come up with a specific detail that supports each, at least 3 of these factors. All right, if you've thought of at least 2 specific details that match up with some of those things, we hold up 2 fingers. If you thought of all 3 I asked you for, hold up 3 fingers. Did anybody think of more than 3? Excellent work, very good. I wonder if you can imagine, because I can definitely imagine, a short answer question, you know, where it would be like, identify the factors influencing American industrialization, provide some historical evidence supporting one of the factors. Can you think of something like that? I can. I can definitely. I've got it. Maybe you should get that too. Okay, so this is just a slide to remind you that the idea behind the market revolution, this notion that we have like specialization and division of labor, like the North, South, and West, is still definitely in effect and is only growing. So during the Industrial Revolution for the United States, we're really going to see specialization continue to grow. So the North will come to rely even more on the West for food, for example. But okay, so we talked a little bit about the Bessemer process and how it's really important. Can you please raise your hand? I promise not to call on you. Please raise your hand if you can articulate to me why the Bessemer process is so important. If you can tell me why the Bessemer process is so important, please raise your hand. Why do we care about that Bessemer process? All right, very good. Would you please turn to someone around you and tell them why that Bessemer process is so important? Go. All right, so the number one thing, let's try to fill in the blank. The number one thing that's important about that Bessemer process is that it helps to blank the cost of producing steel. Yeah, lower or reduce the cost of producing steel. And in doing so, that provides for a whole bunch of other stuff, right? If we can reduce the cost of producing steel, then we can make more steel stuff, like better railroad tracks and better machines and better agricultural implements and all of that. So what the Bessemer process really helps us to lower the cost. So we're going to talk now about a concept called vertical integration. And when you think vertical integration, I always want you to think of the steel industry. And when you think of the steel industry in the Gilded Age, I always want you to think immediately of your friend and mine, Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie was the leader of a corporation known as Carnegie Steel. And it was really under Andrew Carnegie's watch, or his expertise, that the United States exceeded or outpaced the production of those other industrialized countries. So Carnegie was, by all accounts, an industrial, or at the very least, a business genius. He actually has an interesting story. He started out dirt poor. His family immigrated to the United States from Scotland and were discriminated against. He never finished his education. He had to get a job very early on. But he showed an aptitude for business, and he very quickly advanced from being like a page boy to being an assistant to being a telegraph operator to on and on and on. He eventually got enough capital, he began to buy up some railroads and then sell them again, and we'll get into more of that speculative process later. But ultimately, he gets enough capital and he gets into the steel industry. And when he does so, he sort of has a knack for figuring out what's important. So you know what it takes to make steel, right? So I know that this drawing is incredibly precious. But we'll start at the bottom where you, of course, have to have coal, right? Nothing is going to happen without coal. And then to be able to transport, those are railroad tracks. You have to transport your coal to wherever you're going to be producing your steel. And I don't know why it looks like ice cubes, but this is steel, or excuse me, iron ore. So you have to have iron ore and mine it, and then again you have to transport it. You have to have your actual steel production Bessemer process plant that makes the steel, but then usually you have a separate facility that then turns that steel into stuff. So rail ties or plows or whatever else it is that we're going to make with that steel. And of course, if what you own is a steel company, well, what do you have to do? Well, first you have to buy coal from someone, which means you're going to pay for the value of the coal plus the shipping costs, plus a little bit of profit to whoever mined the coal, right? They're not going to sell it to you for exactly what it's worth. They need to make a profit, make a living as well. And then to pay the shipping costs, so again, the value of the tracks and the use of the car, plus a little profit for the railroad company. Then you have to buy the iron ore from somebody for the value of the iron plus a little bit of their profit. You see where this is going? So what happens then is if all you own is a steel processing plant, you're having to pay everybody else's profit along the way too. But what if, you were like a mega bazillionaire and you bought your own coal mine and built your own railroad to transport it from the mine to your plant, and you bought your own iron mine and built another railroad, and then let's say you have your steel company and then you also buy up a processing plant and the railroad that connects the two. Well, that would take a lot of capital up front, but then what? Now, the only costs or profits you're paying are your own, right? So not only can you make more profit because you're not paying anybody else's profit, but you can make more profit while charging lower prices. Think about that for a minute. Because you're not paying anybody else's profit, you as a company can make more profit while charging less, which means what? You're going to make even more, but then you're going to corner the market, right? Who wants to buy from your competitors who are going to sell it for a higher price than you? They want to buy it from you. You can sell it for less and still make more profit than your competitors do. This is the genius of vertical integration, which means owning multiple steps of the process, right? So here are all those steps to producing steel. Andrew Carnegie would ultimately own them all, vertically integrating his company. That not only allows him to be profitable, but allows him to sort of outcompete anybody else. It's not that Carnegie is the only steel producer in America. There are other steel companies in the United States, but they can't really compete with Carnegie. So they have to do what he says, and they can only sell when he says so, and there's a glut on the market and so on. So there's that. But then there's the idea of horizontal integration. And horizontal integration is more likely to be understood as like a traditional monopoly, because horizontal integration means owning all or most of one step of the process. In the United States, horizontal integration was much better known or associated with John Rockefeller. So Rockefeller created a company called Standard Oil. You want to know that. John Rockefeller creates a company called Standard Oil. And he starts out in Ohio, and he begins to buy up various actual oil wells, like getting the oil out of the ground, right? So he buys up these various oil wells. He doesn't manufacture the oil derricks, right? He buys that machinery from somebody else. He doesn't own the pipelines. He doesn't own the refining. But he has bought up a whole bunch of this one step of the process, right? In a geographical region, he's the only person who is pumping oil out of the ground, okay? That's horizontal integration. But I want you to understand that horizontal integration tends to lead in to vertical integration, right? Because if he owns pretty much all of the oil being pumped out of the ground in a particular area, even if somebody else owns the pipelines, who will control the price of what goes into the pipelines? Well, Rockefeller will, right? Because the pipelines have been built, and if they can't get oil from anyone else, are they going to be able to make any money at all? No, so they're going to make however much money Rockefeller says they can make. They're going to do whatever he says because he controls all the oil. They can't make any money without him. Same thing for the refineries. He may not own the refineries at first, but the refineries are going to have to do what he says, because if not, they won't have any oil to refine, to make a profit off of. So horizontal integration will ultimately, Rockefeller will go on to buy multiple steps of the process. Eventually, he owns all of the pipeline, essentially. In the same way, vertical integration tends to also lead to some measure of horizontal integration. One of my favorite stories about Andrew Carnegie is a complicated guy. He's this crazy awesome philanthropist who gives away millions and also is this ruthless capitalist who doesn't have any sense of ethics. Anyway, so there was this other steel company that had found a way. It was super secret. They'd found a way to roll the steel, like the processed steel, into rail ties instead of cutting it into rail ties. And for whatever reason, this process actually improved the stability of the steel. Steel's pretty reliable anyway, but steel does occasionally fail. And the rolling process apparently was even better, helped the steel to be even more stable. And most importantly, it was cheaper, right? It took less labor to do so, cost a whole bunch less. So Carnegie is all of a sudden getting outcompeted by this young upstart company with this newfangled way that Carnegie can't figure out. He tries to send spies, he can't figure it out. So what does he do? Well, remember, he controls a whole bunch of steel, so he has a lot of connections, friends in the railroad industry. He begins to spread lies. He tells his friends in the railroad industry that he has it on good authority that this new company and their newfangled method might be cheaper, but they're cutting corners. Their steel is less reliable. It's going to cause you accidents. You're going to have lawsuits. You're going to have extra costs. Don't buy from them. Well, who are they going to believe? Some young upstart company? Or Andrew Carnegie, who's been in the business and the cheapest there is forever and ever and ever. So eventually, railroads stop buying from this other company. They go out of business. Carnegie buys them, figures out how they're doing it, and adopts it in every single one of his plants to help cut his costs even further. Another example of Carnegie's extraordinary cost cutting. Later in his life, he's built up this steel empire, and so he's building a new plant. He's hired this engineer to construct this big new Bessemer machine or whatever. They got the whole thing done. They've spent, $1 million or whatever it is, lots of money on this thing. And he goes and he's inspecting it. He asks the engineer, so are you proud it's going to be the best in the world? And the engineer says, it's going to be awesome. He doesn't say it's going to be awesome. He's like, it's going to be great. And Carnegie goes, no, I know, but it's going to be the best in the world. And he goes, well, I was going over the diagram, and by my calculations, I think if we had just tweaked this one part, we might have been able to save a penny a ton. But it's all done here, and this is going to be vastly a huge improvement over your old machine. And Carnegie looks at him and goes, a penny a ton, are you sure? And he says, yeah, about a penny a ton, no big deal. And Carnegie thinks in his head he sells about 1 bazillion tons of steel every year. And so he says, tear it down and build it again. And they do. And so they build it again by the new specifications, making that one tiny change, save themselves a penny or so a ton. And in the process, he makes a whole bunch of money, because the volume of steel that Carnegie sells is so great that a penny a ton really does matter. So anyway, this is sort of a look at some of these new ways to organize business. Vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration is associated with who? Carnegie. And what industry? Steel. Horizontal integration is associated with Rockefeller, and the industry was oil. Now, know that this can apply to other industries as well, right? But these are just where these ideas or organizations kind of become a big deal. All right, let's talk about some inventions of the era. I wouldn't expect you or ask you to memorize every single one of these inventions and their inventors, but you want to be able to identify or discuss a few of them. So, for example, we've got the telegraph, which was invented by Samuel Morse, right? As in Morse code. You use Morse code to communicate via telegraph, so Samuel Morse invents the telegraph. The camera is invented by... no, but whatever is named Kodak, as in the Kodak film company. So Kodak invents the camera. We've got processed foods, which are innovated on all over the place. We have the telephone invented by, Alexander Graham Bell, as in, well, I guess we don't have Bell Telephone Company anymore. When I grew up, there was Bell Telephone Company. But so Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone. The phonograph and the incandescent lamp, fancy word for a light bulb, those are both invented by Yeah, Thomas Edison, at his Menlo Park or whatever. And you can see here at the bottom, this is a graphic about patents. The number of patents being applied for, like each consecutive decade, is going to continue to grow. Technology is growing rapidly. We have new technologies which allow us to make even more technologies. It's a pretty cool time for all those people. But of course, if we invent things, people are going to consume them. So imagine life without a telephone. How many telephones does your family own? Think about it for a second. How many telephones does your family own? First, there's cell phones, plus maybe you have a landline phone. Not sure how many families still have landlines, but so a fair number of telephones anyway. Think about cameras. Of course, there's a tough camera in your telephone, plus you might have your own separate camera, or your mom might have a camera to take all those wonderful family photographs that you all love to pose for so much. Well, the Kodak camera that's invented here is the consumer camera. So it's one that you can take around with you. So the cameras that were used, so photography is invented, I guess more properly, so in the 1850s, but the cameras that were used were giant and required you to stand perfectly still for about 10 minutes for the film to develop. So if you wonder why all those old-timey photographs have people not smiling, it's because you can't hold a smile that long. It hurts. And so this is the consumer camera that you can walk around and take a picture and it processes. So okay, along with all these new innovations, we also see the growth of marketing. Because here's the thing about an industrial economy. Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, if everybody's living in cities, can you make all your own stuff anymore? No, right? You really can't make all your own stuff. You can't even make much of your own stuff because you don't have like a little garden plot in the backyard that you can grow from. So when we talked about back in the 1820s and 30s, the market revolution, and how we saw like more specialization, but even then, even if my family farm specializes in growing corn to ship back east in the 1830s, I still probably have my own little vegetable plot, or my own fruit trees, or we keep a couple of cows to milk, to have milk for the children or whatever we have, right? You nod your heads, you're with me? So even though we were specializing back then, most people still had a little bit of land, still made plenty of their own things. But in a world where most people live in the cities, or many people live in the cities, they don't have their own garden plots. If they want fruit, they have to buy it. If they want some vegetables, they're going to have to get a can. If they want the milk, they're going to have to buy milk from a company. So along with this comes a whole bunch of marketing. Then on top of that, remember, if the economy is industrializing, how does an industrial economy continue to make money? By continuing to sell stuff, right? So we need, as an economy, we need people to buy stuff. So the idea of conspicuous consumption, like buying stuff or having stuff just for the purpose of having it, like I have the best kind of jelly here at my tea party. You should be in awe that I don't have that lame kind of homemade jelly or whatever. Or I have these fancy kinds of shoes, or I have a store-bought coat. This notion of consuming for the purpose of consuming, to show how awesome you are, is an innovation of the advertising world. This is one of my favorite ads because it makes no sense at all. So Pear's soap, right? Before, did you care what kind of soap you bought? No, you just bought whatever kind of soap they had at your little general store in your community. But now there's a corporation, there's a factory that makes Pear's soap, and they want to make sure that you buy Pear's soap and not whatever the generic kind is. So they have all these advertisements, and this is one of their most famous. And have you ever heard the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater"? Well, okay, so it comes from the idea that back in the 19th century, when the whole family would take baths, once a week on Sunday, you'd fill this giant bathtub up with water. You have to heat it all up individually on a kettle on the stove. Well, so dad gets to take a bath first, and then mom takes a bath, and then the kids take a bath in age of or order of age. So by the end, the baby takes a bath last. Can you imagine how dirty the water would be after all those baths? So there is the idea that the baby could get lost in the bath water because it was so dirty. So Pear Soap says, don't throw your baby out with the bathwater. Clean yourself with Pear Soap, and you won't have this tragedy happen to you. There we go. But not all is rosy in America's economic growth. We have a lot of growing pains, most of which are caused by speculation. So as we see the profitability of railroads, for example, or we see the profitability of oil rigs, then guess what? People begin to invest a whole bunch of money. Well, let's make more railroad lines. But how many railroad lines do you really need between the same two cities? Maybe 2 would be nice to avoid head-on collisions. But speculation will lead to problems, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Thanks, guys.